All right. So, hello, I am Linda Heitzman-Powell, and I serve as chair of the Behavioral Analyst Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being held remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Denise Seisman.
Present.
Allison Bell.
Present.
Alec Bernstein.
Present.
Wes Dotson.
Present.
Kelly Harrison.
Present.
Emily Kessler.
Present.
Pamela Neidert.
Present.
Christy Marie Steele.
Present.
Stephanie Wiley.
Present.
Mike Williams.
Here.
And Alice Zhang.
Here.
I note the following BSRB members are also present. David Fye.
Here.
And Leslie.
Leslie will not be with us unless we need her to log on. Just for
Okay. All right. Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Linda. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals have requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely, I state for the record the following information. Access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call or by viewing the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended. As such, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On December 18th, 2024, we sent notice of the meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of such meeting. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may call or you may send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I did check the conference call line before we got started. There's no one currently on the line, but if someone logs on and announces themselves, I will let you know.
Thank you, David. So the meeting is now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on the agenda, which is the, or should be the second item at this point, which is the agenda approval.
I'll move to approve.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. And all in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, same sign. All right, motion carries. The agenda is approved. Now we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the approval of the minutes from the previous advisory committee, which was held on December 13th, 2024, and was included in your packet.
Emily moves that we approve the minutes from our last meeting.
Thank you, Emily. Do I have a second?
Second.
Allison seconds. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposition? Motion carries. Awesome. That is great. So now we're going to move on to the executive director's report.
All right. Thank you, Linda. Let's go ahead and start with a couple of notes about BSRB operations, and then I'll touch on some legislative items, and then I'll highlight a few different things from the last board meeting that took place in January of 2025. So first, in terms of operation, you have all probably, I hopefully, have all received some information concerning the survey the BSRB has sent out to licensees. We originally went ahead and sent out that survey to the 6 professions that had not been previously surveyed. As you may recall, we have done a survey for the social workers licensed by the board a few different times over the years, but in the last year, we decided we wanted to let the other professions have input on whether they thought that would be a good idea for their profession as well. And each of the advisory committees did want to participate in that. And so we went ahead putting together survey questions for each of the professions. It was a little bit of a challenging process to get that launched. We had 6 very similar surveys, and there were some unique questions based on level of licensure, based on profession, but we did strive when we could find uniformity on some of the questions. That way we can not only have good reports based on each profession, we can also have some higher level analysis comparing different professions under the BSRB. So we did send that out a couple weeks ago, or actually I think now 3 weeks ago. I did get some feedback from some individuals who had trouble taking the survey, and I had seen that a number of people had opened the survey but not completed the survey. We do have some settings in there that make the results anonymous, but we can still see sort of higher level analytics. And so I've done a few messages reminding people to take the survey, but based on the feedback I received, I have kept the survey open, and it'll be open for 1 more week. I just went ahead and sent out announcements to anybody who had not finished the survey yet, that if they still need to complete the survey, they have 1 more week to do so, and then we'll try to go ahead and close it out, make it complete next Friday at the end of the day. So if you know anyone who has not taken the survey yet, or maybe started the survey and said, I'll come back to that, I really do appreciate the feedback that people have provided to the survey. I'm looking forward to gathering all the results and analyzing it all when it all comes in. But want to make sure you were all aware, if you haven't done the survey, there's 1 more week. And if you have the opportunity to encourage other licensees to do so, while it is an optional survey, I really do want to hear from as many licensees as possible. A couple other items I just want to make you aware of behind the scenes. You may have seen some other announcements about over the last few months. We have rolled out our implementation of our agreement with CE Broker to provide a service to licensees. So as you renew your licenses, 10% of those individuals renewing are selected for audit. And what CE Broker does is provide a free service to licensees with a portal to upload your documentation of continuing education and to assign it to different categories. There are some optional higher level services they can provide at a cost, but no licensee is required to do that. So we went ahead and implemented that over the last about half of a year, doing a few professions at a time, and now we have launched it for all 7 professions. In general, the feedback we've received has been pretty positive. There have been a couple technical issues we've been trying to work with. One of the things you may not think about when you go to our license verification portal, there is a setting that shows that your license is active. Well, when you get close to your license expiring, it changes to active renewal pending. And so making sure the system reads all those different cues to know which licenses are active, which ones could need the settings for this. We've been working through with them, but I think most of those things have been resolved. And like I said, most of the feedback has been pretty positive. We are at a time where we're trying to keep a lot of things moving at once. So you may recall in the past year, we've also updated the BSRB website. That is fully integrated. We have also been meeting with representatives from the Office of Information Technology Services, OITS, to begin the process of having our licensing system moved over to a new platform. The state made an agreement with a company called Acela last year to provide state agencies the opportunity, primarily small licensing boards like the BSRB, give them the opportunity to move over to the new platform. And we're hopeful by moving that direction, we'll gain some additional integration of our processes and allow people to apply for licenses online. And then also have things that are more connected, so it'll be a seamless process. So when you do apply for licensure, instead of using our separate payment portal and doing different things, it'll all be part of one process, and it'll direct people to exactly what you need to pay at the time you need to pay them, or we can turn around and invoice people when they're ready to pay certain things. So really excited about that, but it is a lot of work. They're trying to analyze all of our existing forms And as you might imagine, for all the different professions we oversee, all the different levels of licensure and all the different ways people can apply for licensure, it is quite a bit of material. And they want to make sure they capture everything now so that we can look for areas of more efficient processes for the future. And so that'll be the next step. So this will be something that will probably take a couple of years before we get it all complete. But we will keep you updated as that process goes along. But the staff members that I've been working with for the BSRB, they've been doing a lot of really good work, making sure that OITS understands what someone goes through when they apply for licensure, what the staff timeline is like, and so we can get that continuing to move forward. Moving to some legislative updates. Every legislative session, there's two main items that the BSRB is involved with. One, as a state agency, we have to have a budget approved by the legislature every year. We usually have an approved budget for the current fiscal year, and that would be fiscal year 25. And then we either make adjustments to an already approved future budget year, or we make a request for future budget years. And so we don't get any money from the state general fund. We're a fee-funded agency, so we operate based on the license fees we receive. And by statute, we contribute 10% of all revenue we receive back to the state general fund to fund other operations. But the legislature does set a limit to how much we can spend in any given fiscal year. And so when we submitted our revised budget estimate for fiscal year 2025, we actually came in a little bit under the budget that we had requested the previous year. So we were happy to submit that to the legislature. And then we submitted our revised budget request for 26 and also for 27. When that went through the House Higher Education Budget Committee, they asked some questions. We provided information back to them, and they approved the amounts that we had requested going into the budget in the fall. The budget's a little bit different this year. Normally, the House and the Senate meet separately and review the agency's budget around the same time period of the session. This year, the legislature had some special committees that met in the fall, and the legislature wanted to take a different approach to how the budget process would work. Usually, we submit our budget in September, which we did this year as well. Then the governor's office reviews that and makes a recommendation the first or second week in January, and then that usually is the base by which the legislature makes further adjustments. This year, what the legislature chose to do is when the agency submitted their budget, the legislature basically began to review those agency budgets in the fall. And so while the governor did come out with a recommendation on certain expenditures, the legislature had a very similar recommendation, not necessarily for every expenditure, but they basically came out with their own appropriations bill as a starting point based on what those special committees had looked at in the fall. And so that was essentially what they were using as their starting point this year, as opposed to the governor's recommendation. For our purposes, everything so far has been pretty smooth. We have been approved for the same amount on the House side. The Senate side has not met to consider the budgets for individual agencies yet. What they have announced publicly in the Senate Ways and Means Committee is that they are going to wait until the House runs a budget bill. And then if that passes the House floor, then that's sent over to the Senate. I think they will consider all agencies together as part of that process. If they modify that and change it, that we'll wait to see that. But I think that's probably what they will do this session. So a little different. I've never seen it this way before, but we're happy to adapt and do that. And as I said, right now, there's no changes from what we had requested. So we will just be watching and waiting for how that process will wrap up this year. And just kind of to let you know sort of what the how the funding works for the agency. I mentioned we don't get any money from the state general fund. We operate based on the balance of fees we collect. The current expenditures for the agency have been around $1.2 million in each fiscal year. That's July 1st through June 30th. The amount that we have in our one fund for the agency is about $1.8 million. So about 1.5 times our annual budget. That's what we have available. That number has been going down over the last few years. The agency lowered fees back in 2019, experienced some unusual savings because of the pandemic and not being able to have people, travel or attend meetings in person. But once things stabilized, we've kind of gone back to what we've been experiencing in terms of expenditures. We've also added some additional staff over that time period to help out with faster processing times and different things like that. So our expenditures have gone up accordingly. But then earlier this year, or I guess now last year, the board did vote on some additional fee decreases. And so those will be going through the process. And once those are implemented, we'll be able to see another decrease in our revenue. We are planning for that not to drop too sharply, because once it gets down to about 1 year of expenditures, we would want it to kind of level out. But we are hopeful that with the continued growth in licensees, that we won't have to make adjustments to any kind of fee increases anytime in the near future. I mentioned there's two things usually the agency takes care of in terms of legislative responsibilities. One is the budget for the agency. The other is legislation that comes through. So we monitor legislation. We give the board the opportunity, if they want to have real quick meetings, take a position on any type of bills or resolutions that come through. That is challenging this time of year because sometimes bills are out there and there's an opportunity for us to have a discussion on those as a board. Other times a bill will be introduced very quickly and then scheduled for a hearing very quickly, and the board won't have the opportunity to get together to discuss whether or not to present testimony on it. So to the best of my ability, I try to monitor that, make the board aware of bills that I'm hearing about. And if the board would like to meet and take a position on certain bills, we try to do that, but sometimes the time frame doesn't allow that. We also have a bill the BSRB board has requested to be in the legislature this year, and that was delivered to the Reviser of Statutes office in the first week in January. Unfortunately, this has been an unusual year, and between the additional budget responsibilities their office had and the volume of bills, I think they just maybe were a little bit pressed in terms of putting out all of the different bill drafts. And so by the time our bill draft was available to be introduced in committee, it was essentially past the point that we could introduce it in the House Health and Human Services Committee, which is the committee that I've been speaking to the chair about, and they were open to us allowing the bill introduction in their committee. So since that deadline has passed, we asked if the chair would be willing to make the bill introduction request in an exempt committee. There's certain committees that have deadlines for bill introductions and others that don't have deadlines. But what we're hearing is that it's going to be very challenging. It sounds like that perhaps leadership is wanting there to be sort of a cutoff this year so they can deal with the bills that are already out there. I know there's a lot of support for the items in the BSRB bill, so we're trying to pivot a little bit, and I have a meeting set up on Monday to talk to one of the chairs of the Senate committees to see if we can have the bill introduced on the Senate side. I just want to gauge expectations. At this point, it may be difficult for the bill to come forward this session. The language would still be alive because it hasn't been introduced to the bill yet, so it'd be available for next session, but I'm still holding out hope that perhaps we can get an introduction in an exempt committee and then make it through the process this year. So just kind of wanted to give you an update on all that. This doesn't happen very often. Usually there is more time, but I also know that, you know, in working for the Legislative Research Department years ago, and then also working with members of the Reviser staff, they have a tremendous amount of work that they do during the first month of the session, and they do the best they can, but they are still human and they need time to work on different things. And so really appreciate the work that they do. It's just, we kind of got caught in a difficult spot this year. So I will try to keep you informed if our bill is introduced and we're able to get a bill hearing on it. I will let all of you know, so you have the opportunity to provide feedback or potentially provide testimony on that bill if it's in front of a committee. But just kind of wanted to let you know about the expectation for the bill going forward this year. And then just to highlight a few items from past board meetings, the board did meet January 13th. One of the items that the board heard about is the board does have a designee on a group called the Kansas Vice Addiction Grant Review Board. That is an entity that has been meeting for the last few years. And that is a board that is made up of appointees from a few different entities. And it works with the proceeds from federal litigation involving opioids. And it was set up by the legislature to essentially provide grants to organizations that are providing addiction-related services. And so the board's designee is Jason Hess, and he was able to attend that meeting virtually and provide a little bit more information about his role on that group and the work that they're doing. He usually provides a written update for all the regular board meetings. The board asked him to attend remotely just to give a little more detailed explanation. So if you're interested in that, you may want to go and listen to a little bit of the discussion at the last board meeting. In terms of some other items, The board was provided with an updated copy of all the unprofessional conduct regulations. We have now incorporated all of the proposed changes from each of the advisory committees. And what we asked the board to do was to review all of those in anticipation of the board voting to approve the changes or potentially add in any additional items that it may be missing, or to try to standardize things at the next board meeting. So we anticipate there being discussion by the board at the March board meeting about unprofessional conduct. We also provided the board some possible language on an expedited application review process. This is something we've been working on behind the scenes for a while now. The board has been charged to come up with a process for that, but as we've been trying to model that upon existing entities that have an expedited application review process, there really aren't a lot of entities in the state of Kansas or outside the state of Kansas that I have found that have a model that we can use as the guideline for that. So we have been trying to think creatively in terms of how we can apply that to the professions under the BSRB. And so we did come up with some good language for the board. The board was supportive of that. So we will have that in the form of official regulations the board can review and potentially vote on at the next board meeting in March. There were a couple of recommendations that went before the board from the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee and also the Master's Level Psychology Advisory Committee. Both of those had to do with changing some of the references to what kind of coursework would be required to be done in person or whether it could be done remotely. There was also the definition of in residence that changed for a lot of the professions under the BSRB over the last year. For the professions modified their definition of in residence to either mean in the physical presence of the university or by synchronous video conferencing over screens. And so it did create a little bit of an issue upon further review because these two professions, master's level psychology and licensed psychology, continue to use that term, but it means something different for those professions. So we proposed a fix to go ahead and remove that definition from their terms and then just specifically say what would be required for that coursework for those professions. That way we're not using the same term, meaning two different things based on the profession. And the board was open to those changes. And then we discussed to the board one more item, and that was there is a national association, it's the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, ASPPB. And I know this is a different profession, but I want you to kind of understand some of the discussion about testing that's going on at the national level. For the psychology profession, their conversation on testing recently has been that the board of that association that does the licensing test, the EPPP, they had basically decided that as of January 1st of 2026, states that wish to continue to use their licensing examination would have to require applicants to pass a second examination called the EPPP2. This is not something the body had voted on. This is not something they had asked for all the states' support on. It was something that the board of that association had decided to do. And a number of states were having challenges in terms of implementing that requirement. So there was a movement by some boards to propose a bylaw amendment to make that optional for states. It came to a head at the annual meeting last year. Ultimately, a week before that national meeting, the board of ASPPB decided to reverse course, decided that they would not require that second test as of January 1st, 2026, but instead put together a task force to try to integrate components of both tests into one test. And so what it brought to light was there is a really bumpy path for states in terms of making sure that their voices are heard and in terms of making sure that big critical decisions come before the body when the body would like to have a voice in those conversations. So what I brought before the board was a number of states would still like to have a bylaw committee for that association to make sure that we can have better processes for that going forward. And so I wanted to bring that to the board and make sure they were supportive of me going forward with that. And the board was supportive of that. So just this past week, I received an email from ASPPB concerning a bylaw committee, and they were asking for individuals to volunteer to serve on that. So I will be contacting them and submitting a letter of recommendation or a letter of reference and also a resume to try to serve in that capacity. One of the things, you know, we have state level associations, we have national associations, but we need to make sure that our voice is heard in both forums. And the more work, the more volunteer work that we do and serve on these committees, I think the more respected we are as a state And so our voice has weight. And so trying to make sure that the goodwill that we've built up over the last few years can translate into making some real positive changes so that when there are other states that are having problems in the future, it won't be quite as bumpy as it was recently. So I realize that's a different profession, but since we are one profession under the BSRB, one board, I try to keep you aware of all the different things going on for the 7 professions. So with that, I will go ahead in my report and see if there's any questions over the items I talked about under operations, legislative items, or from the board meeting.
So when would the Senate hear our bill or our request?
Yes, so basically every year there's hundreds of bills that get introduced
Mhm.
and they don't all get a hearing. And honestly, behind the scenes, there's a lot more bills that are drafted that never actually get a bill number because if they're not introduced in a committee, they don't come forward and you don't actually see them in the bill packet. And so ours has been drafted for a little while. It has not been introduced in a committee, so it is available. If we can get a bill introduction in an exempt committee, then they can assign a bill number to it. And then the next step would be for it to be assigned to a committee. And then we would have to be working with the chairs of those committees to request a bill hearing. So
Yeah, but if you introduce it to this on the Senate side, when does that happen?
so I have a meeting with the chairman on Monday
Okay,
to try to see if there can be an introduction. And then if that is if he's agreeable to that, then it would need to happen in a committee. And then there would need to be officially a number assigned to it. It would get published, and then once introduced, they would assign it most likely to the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. And then I'd be working with the chair of that committee to try to get a hearing on the bill. It would still need to get a hearing, get passed by that committee, passed on the Senate floor, and then it would move over to the House side, be assigned to a House committee. You would need to try to get a hearing on the House committee and then pass there. And if there's no items of difference, at that point it could move forward. But there's still quite a few steps, and that's why I wanted to gauge expectations.
Mhm.
Based on how fast the legislature is moving this year, it is possible they may say, we would like this bill to go forward. I mean, for people that I've talked to, I don't think that they're opposed to the items in the bill. It just may be a timing issue where unfortunately it's possible the bill may not go forward this year.
Right, and so the time frame would be between now and mid-March?
Probably,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay,
Now, if it's introduced, one of the neat things is if it's introduced by an exempt committee, that means that it will survive all the way till the end of the session. Not this session, but the biennium. So it'll last until next year as well.
okay,
If it's introduced in a non-exempt committee, then basically it needs to be dealt with that year. And if it's passed by that committee and not passed by the chamber, it can essentially die if it doesn't move all the way through. But if it is, they call the term blessed. If it touches an exempt committee, either meaning it's been referred to that committee at one point or it's been introduced by that committee, then it will live for the entire 2-year time period biennium if it doesn't move forward automatically.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a little complicated. Most of this is kind of, done behind the scenes and there's not a lot of ability to it. But in this case, I think just because of the full volume of bills, it wasn't available to be introduced until it was too late, basically. So.
Thank you.
I have a question, David. So thank you for sharing the behind the door, like we couldn't see, but like, is there anything that we can do or we just have to wait?
I think you just have to wait, unfortunately. If we can get the bill introduced, there can be support for the bill to receive a hearing. But unfortunately, right now, it's just language that's kind of floating out there. We have something called an RS number, but that's really just a revisor of statute draft number. What officially happens is a member of a committee would have to introduce the bill and say, I'd like to do a bill introduction for a bill to the BSRB. It has RS number XYZ. And then they might ask them questions about what's in this bill. And the person might talk for 15 seconds. But then once that occurs, it's been officially introduced, and then it would be published in the bill packet with a number. And once it has a bill number, it's a lot easier to kind of have some traction on it because it's easily identifiable. People can find it on the legislative website, but unless it's introduced, there's really no way to find the language for it. So.
All right. Any other questions? Thank you, David, for that update. And so now we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is the annual training for board and advisory committee members, which is a requirement, an annual requirement for all of us as members of the advisory committee. So, David, you're on again.
Okay, great. And I do want to thank one of our staff members here. Her name is Emma. She has been a part-time staff member for the BSRB for the last couple of years, and she recently changed to a full-time position. And part of her new responsibilities are helping me out with some assistant type roles. And one of the things that I asked her with help on our annual training had gotten a little unwieldy over the last few years, and it had got up to about 150 or so slides. That's a very big presentation. So she was able to review that, and we kind of worked on it a little together, and it has been reduced down to about 70 to 75 slides, which is still quite a few, a lot of good material to cover, but she was able to cut it in half. So I really want to give her credit. She's been very helpful so far, and looking forward to helping her see other parts of the office and get some more feedback. And she's helping me with some different things. So, and I will highlight a couple things that are not part of the official training, but we'll go through some overall information about the BSRB. I did include a couple of extra documents in your packet that I just thought I would highlight for you. For every full board meeting, I show the board some historical information about permanent licenses, and I try to help them understand sort of the trends. I mentioned the BSRB had decreased fees a couple times over the last few years, and thankfully, part of the reason that the balance in the BSRB fee fund has not gone down faster is because we have continued to see steady growth in the number of licensees. So every board meeting, I provide this document here. It's a history of permanent licenses under the BSRB. You can access this with any board meeting packet, but it breaks it down per level of license under the BSRB, and the change in number of licensees going back to July of 2015 through January of 2025, which is the last time we ran this report. And this page has each level. The second page of the report is very similar. It has the same numbers, but they're grouped by profession. And so you can see that back in January of 2015, the number of permanent licensees under the board was about 12,152. And currently in January of 2025, that number has increased from 12,152 to 16,111. And so that's been a really positive growth. Some professions have grown more than others, but across the board, we've seen maybe some leveling of certain license levels, or, for let's say social work, the bachelor's level licenses have decreased. But at the same time, the number of clinical licenses, those people that are practicing independently, have increased by a lot larger amount. So what we're seeing is some internal shifts. People are staying in school longer. People are pursuing their clinical level licenses more to practice independently. So we have a lot more people out there practicing and providing services. So just like, I don't show this to you every meeting, but I thought it'd be helpful for you to kind of understand some of the information the board is receiving. You can understand some of the trends. I also provided another document in your packet of material that I thought was really interesting. There are different groups that analyze states based on license requirements, and there was a group called the Arkbridge Institute that came out with an occupational licensing index. And what they were looking at was basically how difficult it is to get licensed in different states. And I thought one of the interesting things about that study and the rankings is they said in 2024, the state with the highest occupational licensing burden was Texas, followed by Arkansas, Tennessee, Oregon, and Alabama. And one of the interesting things about that is they found that the state with the lowest occupational licensing burden is Kansas. Kansas was ranked as the state with the least occupational licensing burden, followed next by Missouri at 50, Wyoming at 49, Indiana at 48, and New York at 47. So I think those numbers might be really surprising to some people. And I don't know a lot about the Archberg Institute, but if you look at the document that I provided, there's a link to a much larger report, and you can look through some of the details there, see specifically which occupations were included, but I found that to be kind of interesting. So feel free to take a look at that as time allows. I think you'll find that to be sort of an interesting study and interesting report. Now I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen again, and we'll get into the actual training. It may be helpful to go ahead and share questions till the end of the presentation, because we'll go through a few different things. I know maybe we'll answer some of those as we go through additional slides, but you should be seeing, can everybody see the training right now? Okay, great. Well, this is the training. It's an annual training, as Linda mentioned. We put this together for board members and advisory committee members. Years ago, it was done by legal counsel for the board, but this transferred over to me about 3 or 4 years ago. So we do try to walk through, and we provide some information about the agency, some of the documents that show expectations for board members and advisory committee members, and then go through some general information, how members are held to certain standards based on the fact that we are a state agency. So first, to frame this conversation, the mission of the BSRB and the intent of the Kansas legislature is to protect and serve consumers of services offered by BSRB licensees through the issuance of licenses, resolution of complaints, and the creation of appropriate regulation. And that's accomplished through efficiency, fairness, and respect to all those involved. And if you notice, the emphasis there at the beginning is that the legislature did create the BSRB to protect and serve consumers of services. So while a lot of our interactions are with licensees, our primary charge from the legislature is to make sure that citizens and members of the public are protected. The history of the agency is that the BSRB was established in 1980 to license and regulate psychologists and also social workers in Kansas. The legislature combined the responsibilities of the State Board of Examiners of Psychology and the Board of Social Work Examiners. And then over the year, the BSRB's jurisdiction has expanded to include the licensure of professional counselors, master's level psychologists, marriage and family therapists, addiction counselors, and behavior analysts. Rather than have a separate board for each of the different professions, in other states, what we have here in Kansas is known as a composite board. And that means that our board is one board, but it is made up of individuals that are licensees and also individuals from the public. And some of the benefits of having a composite board is that we are able to save on operational expenditures by sharing resources and utilizing licensing and investigative staff for similar subject areas. One way to understand the role of the BSRB is to compare it to different associations. So the regulatory boards primarily exist to protect consumers, are created by the legislature, governed by statute, whereas associations exist to enhance or promote professions and are sometimes created by members of those professions. In terms of the BSRB as a snapshot of the agency, we have 12 staff members, including myself, an executive director, assistant director, and licensing manager, licensing specialists, investigators, and also clerical staff. We are also known as a fee-funded agency. That means we do not receive any funding from the state general fund for operations, but by statute, we contribute 10% of all revenue, or up to a cap of $100,000 per year back to the state to help fund other operations. And then we do earn our revenue primarily from license fees, and the annual budget is a little over 1.1 million or 1.2 million, depending on the year. The board is, so the name of the agency is, of course, the BSRB, but there is also a separate board of the BSRB, and all board members are appointed by the governor to serve a 4-year term. Board members may be reappointed for a second term, allowing for service on the board for a maximum of 8 consecutive years. And then I listed the composition there by statute. There's 1 addiction counselor, 1 marriage and family therapist, 1 master's level psychologist, 1 professional counselor, and then 2 licensed psychologists, 2 social workers, and 4 public members. 2 of the main functions of the BSRB are licensing and then investigation of complaints or discipline. And then I did show you that chart recently. This was actually from the meeting before, which showed there were just about 16,000 active permanent licenses under the BSRB. They are broken out there by license type. Concerning investigation and discipline, as a public protection agency, the BSRB investigates complaints against practitioners under the authority of the board. The agency has administrative authority over practitioners, so this process does not take the place of criminal or civil proceedings. What we mean by that is occasionally we do get a complaint against a licensee, but it may seem that someone is in danger or that there is a matter that really should go to law enforcement. We want people to understand that there is a separation. We deal with individuals on behalf of the state of Kansas concerning their license to practice, but that does not mean that any issues to be brought to us may be more suitable for something of a criminal nature to go to law enforcement. Additionally, sometimes people come to the BSRB with a complaint and they want us to go after someone on their behalf, and that's not the role that we serve either. We don't ever tell someone they should sue someone or they shouldn't sue someone, but that's just not our jurisdiction. That's more of a civil proceeding if someone wants to sue someone in court. We do have administrative authority, but as I mentioned, that is limited to the person's license to practice and then our ability to act on behalf of the state. In fiscal year 2024, which wrapped up at the end of June 2024, the BSRB received 162 complaints, reports of alleged violation against practitioners, which was 38 less than fiscal year 2023. In general, for non-pandemic years, we've seen about 200 complaints per year, but they were a little bit less last year. In terms of the investigative process, complaints are reviewed to determine whether the BSRB has jurisdiction over the issue and whether the matter involves a potential violation of the statutes and regulations for the profession. Complaints are reviewed by a subset of the board, known as the Complaint Review Committee or the CRC. Some of the common violations that we see, falsifying continuing education requirements, which would occur when someone renews their license and has an audit violation. There are other individuals that practice without a license or practice with an expired license. There are dual relationships, and some of those do involve conflicts of interest. There's also making sexual advances towards or engaging in physical intimacy with any client, refusing to report termination or suspension when that is because of certain reasons that are listed in the unprofessional conduct regulations. Again, confidentiality violations, and then practice issues, such as performing services inconsistent with one's education or accepted professional standards. While our primary two focuses are on licensing and investigation or disciplinary matters, we also value outreach. So in my role as executive director and in Leslie's role as assistant director and licensing manager, we speak with groups of students and provide information on licensing and disciplinary matters to students to provide a proactive approach to assist individuals before they become licensed. We find that one of the things that is helpful is to make sure people know the resources of the BSRB and our role in making sure they have a good understanding of the law. And so we do talk to groups of students at different levels, but a lot of them right before they graduate and are applying for licensure. Also, to provide public access to board and advisory committee meetings, we launched a YouTube channel back in January of 2021. And since that time, we've broadcast over 180 meetings. Those have been streamed live or uploaded to the YouTube channel, and we have more than 10,000 views of those meetings. So we know that members of the public, licensees, maybe students, are having a much more easier time accessing the information and how hard the board is working on modernizing the requirements for licensure and making sure that that's not coming at the sacrifice of public protection. So we're really proud of our YouTube channel. I think it's a nice resource for people so they can be a part of the conversation. We also have a new website that I had mentioned, ksbsrb.ks.gov. It's the same address we had previously, but it has been modified for more mobile accessibility and to streamline some of the services we offer. There is a license renewal portal where people can renew their licenses online. There's also copies of forms and other application materials, statutes and regulations. There's links to those. The statutes linked to the Revisor of Statutes Office, the regulations to the Secretary of State's office, where those are kept. Proposed changes to statutes and regulations, if those are out for comment or we have a bill, we make that a news item so people can know about that going on. There are reports, complaint or alleged violation forms to report complaints. There's also disciplinary orders when something has become a final and public order. For public protection, we do post those so individuals are aware of what has transpired. And then there's also information on board and advisory committee meetings. Now I'll shift focus and talk a little bit about the authority of the BSRB. So to understand the agency in another way, I want you to understand the 3 different levels of authority that we operate under. First and foremost, it's the statute. And so primarily the statutes KSA 74-7501 through 74-7511. And there are links to each of those on the BSRB website. But basically the statutes are law, and most of the language of the statutes that comes from when bills are passed by the legislature and it goes into effect, it either becomes a new statute or it amends an existing statute. If you see KSA, that is a statute, and that's what that stands for. For the regulation, we'll talk a little bit more about the hierarchy and how this works, but regulations fall under statutes. And so there's a separate regulation for each profession, and then there's separate regulations for different areas, but the regulations are within the statutory framework for the agency. And then third, the agency is able to adopt policies or guidance documents to help with agency operations or different things like that. Now, in your packet of material, you have a document called Expectations of Board Members. This was something that the BSRB board members put together several years in the past. While the governor does appoint board members and has authority to remove board members, the board members wanted to put together a document that they could adopt on their own that would clarify the expectations for board members serving on the board of the BSRB. Some of the guiding principles in that document, it states that persons in Kansas should expect that licensed mental health providers are qualified, competent, and professional. That persons regulated by the BSRB shall expect equitable and fair treatment in relation to licensing activities, disciplinary processes, and administrative regulations. The BSRB shall provide all services in a manner that is timely, cost-efficient, courteous, and competent. The BSRB shall be guided and led by ethical principles, clear policies, progressive thinking, and strategic decision-making, and the BSRB shall respect the dignity and worth of all individuals. Concerning BSRB services, BSRB will process license applications and license renewals in a timely manner, take disciplinary action when appropriate, provide timely information to the public, and maintain rules and regulations and statutes. One of the other areas in the expectations of the board members document, the board wanted to highlight certain items for a code of conduct, and one of those was integrity. The document states that a board member of the BSRB should have no criminal or professional misconduct record, nor commit acts that would lead to investigations or complaints. Board members should possess sound moral principles, for example, be upright, honest, and sincere. Board members should have courage of convictions to withstand pressures to be swayed from the public protection agenda, should be honest about personal agendas and leave them outside the boardroom, should reveal any actual or perceived conflicts of interest and appropriately recuse themselves from decisions or actions in those areas of interest, should not represent their personal opinion as that of the board, and should be limited to 1 unexcused absence per year. Additionally, concerning conflicts of interest, having any interest, financial or otherwise, direct or indirect, or engaging in any business transaction or professional activity which is in substantial conflict with the proper discharge of the board member's duties in the public interest would be what the board would look at as a conflict of interest. Board and advisory committee members must make public or recuse themselves from any conflict of interest that arises. This ensures the integrity of the board and all its decisions. Types of potential conflicts could be for personal gain, bias for or against someone, or effects on personal relationships. Common components of conflicts of interest. A board member of the BSRB should have no personal financial benefit as a result of service to the BSRB except sustenance and mileage. A board member of the BSRB who may have a conflict of interest according to stated criteria should refrain from voting on the matter. A board member of the BSRB should disclose any relationship with any other agency or individual involved with the BSRB and be excluded from matters involving such a conflict. A board member of the BSRB serving as part of an organization working in any way with the BSRB should inform the board chair. A board member of the BSRB should not accept any gifts or promotional items received as part of their affiliation with the agency for personal use, and a board member of the BSRB should not use the agency's name or agency information for personal gain. Now, I do want to pause here and say, I know we're going through a lot of information about board members, and as advisory committee members, you may be asking yourself, how does this apply to me, or what should I take from this? When we get to the advisory committee policy, there is some language in that policy that says the same policies and procedures that the board members follow should also apply to advisory committee members. And while there are some differences based on, board members being appointed by the governor, advisory committee members being appointed by the chair of the board, and there's some other differences that are notable based on that language, I think what you can take from this is that while these are expectations for board members, a lot of the same concepts should carry over. And I think you should strive to meet the same aspirational goals of these expectations and avoid the conflicts of interest. So I feel like the information, for the most part, is transferable over to both groups. In terms of personal conflicts, actions that may ultimately have a personal consequence or a direct or indirect effect of a decision or action, and no decision should be made that will advance the personal benefits of a board or advisory committee member. Concerning confidentiality, protected information must remain confidential during and after board membership, and board discussion involving any of the following matters shall remain confidential unless the board expressly agrees to the contrary. Any discussion that occurs during an executive session, any discussion concerning actual or potential litigation, and examples of times when confidential information could be discussed within those executive sessions during an open meeting or deliberations after a hearing. Now, as advisory committee members, you probably will not be asked to participate in a hearing. That is something the board members usually serve as in charge of under certain procedures. Executive sessions are rare. If you're not familiar with those, should we ever go into executive session as a group, it will be very clear. There will be an official motion, and that language for the motion will be written into the minutes for the meeting, and anything in the executive session will be done outside of the regular broadcast meeting. So we will likely go to a separate confidential phone line or something like that. But executive sessions for advisory committee member meetings are pretty rare. In terms of authority, the board chair will preside at all meetings, appoint members of the advisory committees, appoint members of the CRC, the Complaint Review Committee, appoint members to other ad hoc committees, and the vice chair will discharge the duties of the chair in his or her absence, disability, resignation, or death. The expectations of the board members document also outlines some structure concerning the board and the executive director relationship. The executive director will communicate any personnel matters that should be addressed by the board to the board through the chair of the board. And then the chair of the board will present these board-related issues to the board, and the executive director will communicate to the staff the board's wishes, intentions, and policies. In terms of executive expectations, the executive director shall keep the board advised of BSRB activities by issuing a report to the board at each full board meeting, which summarizes pertinent information. The executive director shall prepare the agenda for the board meetings in consultation with the board chair, and the executive director shall prepare the agenda in consultation with the board chair for an annual board retreat, which shall allow for issues before the board that require in-depth consideration. We don't generally use the term retreat anymore, but the board does still have an out-of-town in-person planning meeting, and that meeting does move around the state. The last 4 years, we had that meeting remote because of the pandemic, followed by an in-person meeting in Kansas City. Then we had one in Wichita, and then we had one of those in Lawrence. And those are open to the public. I think we've had public attendees at all of them, I can remember. Not very many, but it is open to the public, and public can come and observe those meetings. Those aren't broadcast because of the different locations we use. They don't all have the same level of ability for us to broadcast them with technology, but they are open to the public, and it does give the board an opportunity to discuss things that require more in-depth discussion or a full day of meetings. There's also information in the form and policy document that talks about the delegation to the executive director. The executive director shall be the administrative head of the organization, serving under the board at all times. They are responsible for implementing and executing the policies and activities approved by the board. They shall recommend policies and activities for consideration by the board, have sole authority to employ, eliminate, and fix the duties and salaries of other employees or independent contractors of the organization, subject to policies, regulations, and limitations approved by the state of Kansas. Now, should I ever want to hire someone to work for the BSRB, we would need to have a position available. Officially, there's not a limitation on the number of full-time equivalent positions, but the legislature does watch that very closely. And so there's also checks in place if I would want to hire someone for a certain salary as an executive branch agency that has to be approved by the governor's office. And so the governor does have veto authority over both the amount that I might propose for someone or a certain person, if the governor does not want that person to be hired from the BSRB. So while I do have the authority to put those forward, there are still some other checks in place under the law. Concerning monitoring of the executive director's performance, the board shall, when necessary, utilize executive sessions to discuss issues concerning the executive director, and the board shall formally evaluate the performance of the executive director each calendar year and on an annual basis thereafter, with emphasis on whether set outcomes are attained. And I think that's a very good practice. The board does do an annual performance review, and they provide feedback to me on things that I could make some improvements on and things that I'm doing well. So appreciate their feedback with that. Moving next to another document you have in your packet concerning the training, and that is the advisory committee policy. It's a short document. It's just a little over 1 page. What that document does is it outlines the advisory committee purpose, which is to support the board of the BSRB in carrying out its mission to protect the public. The process to do that, advisory committees fulfill their purpose by addressing issues referred to them by the board, and advisory committees may suggest issues that the committee believes the board should consider by referring them through the chair of the advisory committee. Once an issue is referred to the board has 3 options: either address the issue at the board level, refer the issue back to the advisory committee for additional information, or not take any action on the issue. The document talks about the structure of the advisory committee, that the chair of the advisory committee will be a member of the BSRB board, and a public board member will also be a member of the advisory committee. There will be a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 10 additional advisory committee members. The executive director is a non-voting ex officio member. The assistant director and licensing manager is encouraged to attend advisory committee meetings, and we've kind of backed that off a little bit to make sure that Leslie has enough time for other responsibilities. But if we have any kind of conversations about regulation, we will ask her to attend. And then legal counsel representing the board should attend meetings when their attendance is requested. The terms for advisory committee members are 2 years, and advisory committee members are appointed by the board chair and can serve up to 8 terms, with a 2-year break in between the 4th and 5th term. This has been a recent change. You may recall previously they talked about advisory committee members could serve up to 4 terms, each being 2 years long, for maximum service of 8 years. But there were individuals who had previously served in the advisory committees that would still like to be actively involved and have a lot of institutional knowledge. And so while the board saw the benefit of making sure that new voices came on the advisory committee, they wanted to provide a path if individuals did want to come back after a certain length of time. So what the board recently made a change to was advisory committee members could serve up to 4 terms, and then they would have to come off the advisory committee for at least 2 years. And then after a 2-year break, if they wanted to be considered for advisory committee membership in the future, they could be considered again, but there would need to be a break between the 4th and 5th term. If they were appointed to the advisory committee again in the future, they would be eligible to serve that term plus an additional 3. So yeah, all in all, they could serve for 8 terms, which would be 16 years, but they could not serve all of those consecutively. And the document does also say that it's recommended the appointments to the advisory committee are staggered to avoid too many members reaching their maximum length of service at the same time. And then there was that language I talked to you about during the expectations of board members policy. It says the policies and procedures under which the BSRB board members are expected to operate will also apply to the advisory committee members. So when you remember the language that was in the policy that talked about things like integrity, avoiding conflicts of interest, a lot of that language, I think, while it's not maybe specifically referenced in the advisory committee policy, I think you can take that from the expectations of the board members document and apply it over to your role in this capacity as well. Concerning the selection of advisory committee members, nominations can be made by the public, committee members, members of professional organizations, and through self-nomination. Committees should ensure diverse representation, including geographic setting, gender, culture, ethnicity, and licensing level. Members should represent both public and private sectors, as well as educators in the discipline. The committee reviews nominees, resumes, letters of interest, and their alignment with the board's mission and goals. The committee chair submits recommendations to the BSRB board chair for approval. And then once appointed, the executive director informs new members and may provide orientation to familiarize them with the board and the committee's roles and functions. I mentioned we launched the BSRB YouTube channel, and over the last 4 years, we've had over 10,000 views of the meeting, which was a significant increase above what we had as far as in-person attendees prior to making those available remotely. However, with new sets of eyes came more questions, which is great, but it also led to a lot more people wanting to provide public comment at meetings. And there was a little bit of lack of familiarity with the setup of the board and the role of the advisory committees. So it became clear that it would be helpful for us to have a short document to provide guidance on attendees of meetings and those that request to provide public comment. And if it's granted, what topics are germane for the presentation of public comment. So we put together this document. It is very similar to what the legislature has as a term, as sort of they have documents for public attendees of meetings over at the Capitol. It is posted on the BSRB website as a policy document. It states that public comment is not entitled to individuals, but it may be approved. It outlines the process that should be followed during comments to the board or advisory committees and topics relevant for public comment. And now we'll go ahead and move to another part of the training, which will deal with some general guidance for individuals serving as board members or committee members for state agencies. Some of this will get into a little bit of the law and why we do procedurally what we do here in the office. So we'll talk about some of the rules like the Kansas Open Meetings Act, KOMA, the Kansas Open Records Act, or KORA, and then also the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, KAPA. And then at the end, we will touch upon the Kansas Tort Claims Act, which we hope never comes into play, but I want to make you aware of it as your responsibility as serving on this committee for the state agency. So just broadly, for professional licensing boards, Kansas regulates many professions through licensing boards or commissions created by the legislature to ensure professional competence and public safety. Boards are considered creatures of statute, and that means the board's power is dependent upon its authorizing statute. A board can only exercise authority granted explicitly or implicitly by the Kansas statute. Boards cannot act beyond their statutory authority or in matters not addressed by law. Boards must adhere to constitutional protections as well, such as things like equal protection, due process, and other freedoms such as freedom of speech, freedom of privacy, etc. Actions that are arbitrary, discriminatory, or that violate certain rights, like revoking a license based on a personal dislike, are prohibited. There is legislative authority over the BSRB. We've talked about that at certain times in the past, but the Kansas legislature does have control over certain aspects of licensing boards. Some examples of the legislative control over the BSRB: the legislature could modify the enabling legislation, which would change the purpose of the board. They could limit expenditures in an appropriations bill. If we have no money to operate, the agency simply can't do very much. Could enact new legislation to change the makeup, scope, or powers of the board. When you think about some of the roles that the board has, there is quasi-executive authority, quasi-judicial authority, and then also quasi-legislative authority. It may help to kind of think about it in that frame. Under executive authority, we do follow the Open Meetings Act, KOMA, and also the Open Records Act, the KORA. We'll talk about each of those a little bit more specifically. Under our judicial authority, there is quasi-judicial hearing when we are reviewing facts or when the law violations have occurred, such as in a disciplinary proceeding. We also follow the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, or the KAPA, when it's specifically named and when it's appropriate. And we'll talk about that too. Legislative authority, so we are able to adopt or implement or interpret statutes with more detailed or specific requirements. And this process involves holding an open hearing on proposed regulations, allowing feedback. And there's also oversight by a legislative committee that is known as JCAR, or the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations. The regulatory boards protect the public by ensuring practitioners are competent and authorized the implementation and enforcement of statutes, regulations, and internal policies. Board members must understand their differences between statutes, regulations, and policies to effectively carry out their duties. Under the statutes, those are laws passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, and derived from the Kansas Constitution. Generally, they become effective on July 1st of the session year. What you might see in an actual bill would say something similar to this becomes effective upon, quote, publication in the statute book. Sometimes that actually happens a little bit later than July 1st, but what is sort of understood as is that when it says publication in the statute book, we treat that as July 1st, unless another date is specified in the legislation. And so sometimes they can move that date earlier or later, but if it just says publication in the statute book, we strive for that to be implemented by July 1st. Define the scope of the board's authority to override any conflicting regulation or policies. And if a board requires additional authority, such as investigative subpoena power, it must seek new legislation for that authority. In terms of regulations, these are rules adopted by the board to implement and enforce specific statutes. A board's authority to adopt regulations is derived from statute, and it is developed under the Rules and Regulations Filing Act. And it ensures that public and legislative input, consistency, and legal compliance are all being considered. It fills in details of statutes affecting the rights and responsibility of third parties outside of the board. Once adopted in accordance with the Rules and Regulations Filing Act, regulations have the force and effect of law and are legally enforceable. For a regulation to be valid, it must fall within the board's statutory authority, implement a specific statute, comply with legal requirements and constitutional standards, and regulations that exceed the authority or conflict with statutes or regulations will be voided. As I mentioned earlier, there's a pretty clear hierarchy of power. So statutes, regulations, and then policies. So if a regulation does conflict with a statute, even if there's still language in that regulation that differs, you would follow the statute. And I just mentioned that third hierarchy, policy and guidance documents. And so policies may be adopted by a board only to guide its internal operations, such as prioritizing staff workload or explaining the investigative process. Guidance documents are documents that state the board's current approach to interpretation of law or general statements of policy that describe how and when the board will exercise discretionary functions. One thing that I would recommend is when you're considering how to be effective as a board member or advisory committee member is to watch for conflicts and be alert to the agency policies or internal procedures that may conflict or appear to conflict with statutes or regulations or that impact applicants or licensees. So it is encouraged that you initiate action. So if you come across something or if a statute or regulation is unclear or problematic, take steps to amend them or propose changes. Under discipline, the purpose of discipline is to promote compliance and protect the public. Discipline should not be vindictive or disproportionate to the severity of the violation, and ensure that discipline is fair and proportional. Remember, the primary responsibility of the board is to protect the public, not the license. Under professional activities, board members may hold office in a professional or trade association, but cannot lobby for or vote on matters that affect both the association and their role on the board. Board members must not use their position to promote the interest of a professional association. Board members may attend professional conferences or social events, but must avoid discussing board business. And if a majority of board is present, they must not discuss the business affairs or matters related to a particular pending application or disciplinary matter. And it says, remember to comply with the open meetings laws, which we'll talk about here in a second. But I do want to pause here in terms of professional activities. This is not uncommon. Based on how active all of you are on the advisory committee, I would imagine most of you, if not all of you, are probably working with another group that has similar goals to the BSRB, or maybe just would be involved with mental health topics, or perhaps behavior analysis as a common connection. And that is okay, just because you happen to be involved with different groups. But sometimes we use terminology like make sure you're wearing the right hat in this format, because sometimes there is common ground between your role on the advisory committee versus your role as a member of an association, or maybe even someone who's an officer with a different association. But if there is a conflict of interest, or even if you're concerned there might be a perception of conflict of interest, we always, encourage advisory committee members or board members to err on the side of caution. And if you think it'd be helpful to recuse yourself, to make sure that you keep those two roles separate, we would encourage you to just consider those things and recuse yourself as you see appropriate. Concerning conduct, a board member should not represent themselves as a spokesperson for the board unless authorized by a vote of the board to do so. If unauthorized to give the board's position on an issue, members must clarify that any opinions are personal, not official board positions. Board members should not ask board staff or counsel to provide legal advice or preferential treatment to any applicant or licensee. Now we're going to talk about one of the major laws in Kansas for state agencies and also committees that assist the state agencies. The Kansas Open Meeting Act, or the COMA. So the COMA ensures public access to governmental meetings to promote an informed electorate. The purpose of it is to benefit the public, so COMA is interpreted liberally and exceptions are applied narrowly to carry out its purpose. It applies to all state legislative and administrative bodies, as well as to subordinate groups funded by public money. Subordinate groups are likely subject to COMA if created or extended by a covered entity. COMA does not apply to quasi-judicial functions or proceedings under the CAPA, the judiciary itself, private organizations, or staff meetings of covered entities. The goal of COMA is to ensure transparency in government decision-making for the public. When we talk about meetings, the definition of a meeting is any gathering or assembly in person through the use of a telephone or any other medium or for interactive communication by a majority of the membership of an agency or public body subject to COMA for the purpose of discussing the business affairs of the public body or agency. I'm going to pause here and just make sure that you have some good familiarity with what the COMA applies to. So sometimes when we've done trainings in the past, we've explained COMA, but some people have still walked away from those trainings with a lot of fear and saying, I'm not sure who I can communicate with anymore. I don't want to accidentally violate the law. And so just want to make sure people feel comfortable about this. So there's three real elements where COMA comes into place. One, you have a gathering of individuals, and that could be either in person, it can be by phone, by email, but there is a gathering of people where there is interactive communication. And what I mean by interactive communication, that means that there's back and forth communication. It's not something where someone is sending one direction communication. There has to be that interactive back and forth. It has to involve a majority of members of a body. So if this involves half or less than half, it would not come into play. And then it has to do with the purpose or business or affairs of a public body or agency. So I'll give you some examples of things that would not meet that definition. If you had half or less than half of the members of the advisory committee that came together and wanted to discuss advisory committee work, that would be fine. That does not meet the definition of the COMA. The COMA has to require that it comes into play when you have a majority of members of a committee. Additionally, let's say that the members of the advisory committee wanted to get together and go to dinner or watch a movie or something like that. Well, if you are not talking about the topic that's relevant to the work of the committee, so if you're not talking about behavior analysis, if you're not talking about the advisory committee, you're just all in the same place, that's fine too. It really has to have that back and forth communication. And then the communication has to be the subject of, your membership on an approved group. So, so it is okay to attend a conference. At the same time, you just need to be careful that if there's a majority of members of the committee, you're having back and forth communication, you can't be discussing the work of the advisory committee or things that would be relevant to your work on the advisory committee. So I'll allow some more questions on this topic when we get to the end of the training, but I just want you to all feel comfortable with that. If at any point you would like to reach out to me as executive director, you're happy, like there's no problem doing that. Leslie Allen, the assistant director as well, there's no issue if any of you would ever want to reach out to us with questions. If you would ever want to reach out to the chair of the advisory committee, Linda, you're more than welcome to send a message to her. That wouldn't be an issue. It's really where you have the majority of people. So Ways that which people kind of accidentally fall into this from time to time, don't hit reply all on an email. And so there can't be a back and forth email communication when it comes to things like that. And even if you're just not in person, but you're on some other electronic format, you need to be mindful of that as well. We'll talk about Coma a little bit more.
Emails too, David.
I'm sorry?
I said this includes scheduling emails too.
Yes. And so you got to be careful about that as well. So now there is some extra language on here to make sure people are aware this does apply to electronic formats, so like telephone, electronic mediums like Zoom, Skype, if all Coma requirements are met. And it includes informal discussions before, after, or during recess of a public meeting, all gatherings at any stage of the decision-making process, and it also covers things like work sessions or retreats are subject to the Coma. I mentioned the board gets together and holds an off-site planning meeting, but those meetings are still open to the public. So even though it's not officially at the BSRB office or being broadcast, that still does come into play. In terms of discussion, it does not have to be require binding action or voting, and can occur at social gatherings, retreats, and meetings held in private, and educational conferences or seminars. And when traveling to such meetings, members of the board should avoid discussing agency affairs or business. The presiding officer must provide meeting notice if something falls under the Coma, but can delegate this duty. For the BSRB, our clerical staff are the ones that send out the message concerning when meetings are being scheduled. We also post the meetings to the BSRB website and also put them on a website called the Kansas Public Square, which is basically a website for state agencies in Kansas to note when their meetings are going to take place. Notice is not required to be published in the paper or on a website. Individuals must request it. Requests for notice can be verbal or written and are valid for 1 fiscal year. And notice must include the meeting's date, time, and location provided in a reasonable time before the meeting. In terms of the meeting procedures, Coma does not require following Robert's Rules of Order or any similar format rules of procedure. Coma does not require that a board create an agenda, but if one exists, it must be made available to the public. This is part of the reason why my introductory speech for every meeting talks about a procedure where people can request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to me. Meetings may be recorded if doing so is not disruptive. The public does not have the right to speak, but they do have the right to listen and observe, and secret ballots are prohibited. Concerning the minutes, a board's policy may require minutes to be kept, but the Coma does not require minutes unless an executive session occurs. The motion to enter executive session must be included in the minutes. And then as far as executive sessions go, it permits discussion of certain enumerated matters outside of public view. It cannot result in binding action, but within the executive session, there can be discussion and a consensus is allowed. But any consensus reached must be formalized in an open session vote immediately following the conclusion of the executive session. If there is found to be a violation of the Coma, that is a civil infraction, not a criminal matter. Any person, attorney general, or county district attorney may bring an action in district court. County district attorney or attorney general has subpoena power, and enforcement actions take precedent over all other cases and are assigned for trial at the earliest practical date. Remedies for a Coma violation could include voiding any action taken if prosecuted by the attorney general or county or district attorney, an injunction which would stop the action, a mandamus which would force a certain action, or a declaratory judgment. Also, under the statute, there could potentially be penalties for a Coma violation, a fine of up to $500 per board member for each violation. There could be an ousting from office, a recall from office, court costs assigned to the person seeking enforcement of Coma, court costs assigned against plaintiff if maintained action frivolously, not in good faith, or without reasonable basis in law or fact. So while it is rare to have a Coma violation that would amount to something like that, we do take the Coma very, very seriously. We have a standard process for making sure that we have noticed the meetings out well in advance. And then when the information is available for things like the agenda, we make sure that those are posted on the website and are available at least by the time the meeting begins. Moving next to the Kansas Open Records Act, or the KORA. There is a statute that mandates that public records be open for inspection by any person unless otherwise protected. And the KORA is designed deliberately to promote such policy. For public agencies, this includes state, political, and taxing subdivisions, offices, officers, entities receiving public funds. The instrumentality will not explicitly defined in KORA. Entities created or extended by a covered public agency are typically subject to KORA. So in other words, advisory committees would fall under the KORA. Concerning the public records, it includes any recorded information that is made, maintained, kept by, or is in the possession of any public agency. It does not include records that are owned by a private person or entity. KORA does not apply to private companies, even if publicly funded for services, judges and courts, individual legislature or governing body members, or private individuals. So under the KORA, a board must appoint a Freedom of Information officer to assist with KORA requests. And we do have one appointed here at the BSRB, that is Leslie Allen. We must provide a brochure outlining requester rights, agency responsibilities, and procedures for inspecting and obtaining copies of public records. And that is one of the first documents. If you come into the BSRB office and you look by the clerical desk at the front, we have a copy of our KORA policy, and it outlines what's required here under the law. And it must include contact details for the records custodian, fees, and office hours, and our policy does outline those things as well. Anyone, regardless of residency, can request records. Individuals do not need to provide a reason for requesting records, and the board may require a request to be written with the requester's name, address, and proof of identification. The board may also require the requester sign a written certification that the requester will not use names and address information obtained from the records to solicit sales or services. The board cannot deny a person the right to review public records unless closed by law. And if portions of the record are closed, the remainder must be made available to the requester. So if some of that is not suitable to be provided, you may have to do redacting rather than deny the request outright. The board is not required to make copies of the following available unless shown at a public meeting: recording tapes or discs, videotapes or films, pictures, slides, graphics, or illustrations. Requests must be responded to within 3 business days with 3 possible responses. 1, the requested record is provided in the form requested if possible. 2, the request is under review and the records will be provided if permitted. Or 3, the request is denied with an detailed explanation for the denial. So you do not have to always provide the records within 3 days, but you do need to provide a response to an open records request within 3 days, and then you have to get the records to that person if they are suitable to be provided as soon as you are able to do so, given other factors involved. Under the KORA, public records must be released unless an exemption to disclosure applies. The burden is on the board to provide exemptions, and exemptions can be discretionary or mandatory. The enforcement of the COMA is that KORA, like COMA, is a civil act. Any person, county, district attorney, or attorney general may bring a civil prosecution. The county or district attorney or attorney general may have subpoena power, and there are potentially disciplinary remedies similar to what you saw for the COMA. Potentially a fine of $500 per violation may be imposed for a knowing violation or an intentional failure to furnish information. Costs and attorney fees may be imposed if a denial is found to be in bad faith or without a reasonable basis in fact or law. And violations are subject to trial at the earliest possible date. Before we move to the CAPA, I'll just say a note about the KORA. We do take the KORA very seriously. We have policies in place because of what's required under the law. If you should ever get a KORA request because of your role serving on an advisory committee or with the board, please make us aware of that so we can search for records relevant to the KORA request. And then if there is a matter where our legal counsel needs to weigh in, they can help us with any redacting that's necessary. So please let us know if there comes into play. But most of the time, these requests will come directly to the board office, and so we will handle these on behalf of the board. Under the, one other thing too. So one thing to take away from the KORA is that the vast majority of records the BSRB maintains are probably subject to individuals requesting those records. And one thing that has gotten a lot better over the years is, I think, Several years ago, people expected a certain level of professionalism for written letters, but when people were first starting to use email, there was a lack of formality about some of the language in email. And so I think some groups found it helpful to remind people that even if you do have an email, make sure that you're using language that would be suitable as professionals, because anything that can be in an email might be found to be requested, and then it could be published in the newspaper. And so just make sure that you're always using professional language. And if you ever have any questions about that, just err on the side of caution, but you all are professionals, so you probably don't need the reminder, but it's always one of those things that I find helpful to just make sure people are aware. A lot of things can be found to be records, and some of those things, there can be a little bit of casual conversation, and so you want to make sure that you're always being professional. Moving next to the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, or also the CAPA. This establishes procedural rights and duties under the law. It does not provide substantive law. Substantive laws are governed by the board's enabling and licensing acts. It applies only when explicitly stated by other statutes. It governs procedures for board decisions when specified in the licensing or enabling statutes, and it ensures the board operates efficiently and in accordance with the law while balancing public access where appropriate. Licensing boards must conduct business under the COMA in general, under open meetings, but when statutes direct decisions to be made under the CAPA, the board will follow the CAPA rather than the COMA. So in other words, some of our processes, most of them will be under the COMA, but when we have specific language to follow the CAPA, we will do the CAPA instead. And I know that's a little confusing because those two terms are very similar, but I'll go through some examples to kind of clarify what's under the COMA and what's under the CAPA. So the CAPA sets out a procedure to follow when the board is deciding on what to do in cases involving individual licensees. In these cases, the board conducts quasi-judicial functions in deciding the outcome of the case. So for example, if we're talking about a licensing requirement that would apply to all applicants, well, that's not involving a specific applicant, it's involving all applicants, and that's something that would fall under the COMA. But when it involves something that could involve confidential information or private information about one specific license applicant, that is something that would fall under the CAPA. The CAPA does not require public notification for licensure application reviews or complaint review committee meetings, including probable cause determinations and summary proceeding orders. Only hearings need to be open to the public under the CAPA. And decisions are made upon issuance of a license or order. Public voting is not required. And during CAPA proceedings, relevant board staff and legal counsel may attend to provide necessary information and legal advice to board members. So basically, if someone is an applicant for licensure and the board is deciding that specific application, the board will consider that individual application in a private closed session under the CAPA. If the board determines that they were denying that person's license, or that they were going to grant the license with some conditions, that person will receive a legal order drafted by legal counsel for the board. And within that legal order, it will give them certain remedies, like requesting a hearing if they choose to do so. If they request a hearing, the hearing will be public. And during the hearing, people from the public could sit in on that Zoom meeting, observe the hearing, because the hearing itself is an open meeting. However, or it is open to the public. If it is the initial decision and the discussion by the board about what's going to happen with that specific application, those are not open meetings, those are under the CAPA, and so they are closed. Board activities that are not covered by the CAPA and must be acted on in an open meeting under the COMA include things like approving board minutes, deciding whether to renew contracts or change the way contracted services are provided, delegating authority to a board member or executive director for a particular action, discussions and votes to approve or amend regulations or guidance documents, policy decisions affecting the way the board operates internally, receiving agency updates, including things like the budget, legislation, stats, education, executive director's report. And so basically the vast majority of things the board is going to review are going to be things that would be suitable for an open meeting. But there's a limited number of things that would be under the CAPA. And so the CAPA comes into play specifically when it's referenced. Such as for applications for licensure. Applicants do have the burden of proof. Staff will collect the necessary information for the board to assess whether the applicant qualifies for licensure or if conditions or restrictions apply. And if the board conditions, denies, or restricts the license, the applicant may request a hearing unless agreed to in a consent agreement or order. Under the investigations, the board has the burden of proof to show a licensee has violated statutes or regulations, and licensing boards can investigate complaints with the investigator presenting findings to the CRC. The CRC determines if there's probable ground to believe a violation has occurred based on reasonable grounds, and reasonable grounds basically would be if information would lead a reasonable, prudent person to believe the licensee violated one of the board's statutes or regulations. The Complaint Review Committee must ensure the licensee's conduct that they are accused of actually violates one of the board's statutes or regulations. A licensee doing something that made someone angry, violated a professional association's ethical code, or did not follow an employer's policy does not necessarily mean they violated a statute or regulation. And licensees can request a hearing within a certain prescribed time period. And once the petition or request for hearing is filed, the CAPA guides the proceeding and the hearing. In cases where there is immediate danger to public health, safety, or welfare, the CRC may suspend a license without giving the licensing notice or an opportunity for a hearing, but the licensee may appeal the emergency order to the district court. And before I end the training, there's one last topic I'll make you aware of, and that is the Kansas Tort Claims Act. So the Tort Claims Act governs the liability of the state of Kansas and its agencies and employees, including board members, elected or appointed officials, and others acting on behalf of the government. The Tort Claims Act establishes vicarious liability for wrongful acts or omissions in the scope of employment with potential case-by-case immunity. So in other words, if you are sued for actions than your duties as a board member or advisory committee member, the state will defend you at no cost. But for that to apply, you must submit a written request in 15 days after service of process. It must include a copy of the petition and summons, and you must cooperate in your defense. The state may choose not to defend you if you acted with actual fraud or malice, if you fail to make a timely request for representation, or the judgment is for an act or omission that occurred outside of your scope of duties as a board member or advisory committee member. So before I move on to the last bit here, I have not seen the Kansas Tort Claims Act come up during the 4 to 5 years that I've been executive director for the board. I just like to make sure to highlight it because the work that you do is very important. But as an attorney, I know that someone might ask me every once in a while, can I be sued for this or can I be sued for that? And it's a very different question of can I be sued for that versus is the person likely to win if they sue me for that? Kind of like with a licensee, you can't always control if someone's going to file a complaint against you. What you can control is how you deal with it from a professional standpoint. So if for whatever reason someone should ever initiate a lawsuit against you because of your role on the advisory committee or the board, please let us know as soon as possible and we will pursue a representation for you through the Kansas Tort Claims Act. I hope this never comes up. Like I said, I have not seen it come up, but I want to make you aware of it so that you're aware of different things involved with serving on an important committee like this. And so in conclusion, I recommend becoming familiar with the statutes and regulations for the profession, reviewing policy documents like the expectations for board members document, the advisory committee policy, and guidance for attendees of meetings. Become familiar with the different levels on the BSRB website, our YouTube channel, other resources available for you to use as a board or advisory committee member. Again, we have the website there, ksbsrb.ks.gov. And we'd encourage you to strive to uphold the values for board members and advisory committee members and be mindful of the laws and requirements related to state agencies, such as the COMA, the CORA, and also the CAPA. And then should you go through the slides and have questions, feel free to reach out to me. But I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I know I covered a lot of material. I know that was a lengthy training, but it is very important to make sure that you receive this information. You also received a copy of it. It is posted to the BSRB website. So feel free to go back and reference any part of it. If you don't have questions today, you can always reach out and happy to clarify anything in the future. But I'll pause here and see if there's any questions about anything that I talked about.
Well, here's what I want to say. How many of you sort of kind of felt like you were going to fall asleep during that presentation? Here's the thing. When I was a new board member, I did not understand anything that David was saying during the training. I do now. I understood every single word that came out of his mouth. All the meetings, all the processes that go into it, all the really important work that we do. So just for now, you may think that some of that information that he presented doesn't apply to you. But if we're successful at getting membership on the broader board, then whoever that person is that serves that role, you're going to serve on all these committees. You're going to become, you're going to have to become very familiar with the inner workings of the board and how that applies to our composite board and all of the professions that are regulated by our board, which includes us, right? So even though some of it is very, very difficult, especially for those of you that are new members, it's still all pretty important information. So does anybody have any questions for David about how all that applies to us? Nope. All right. So that was a sad state of affairs, David, that I understood everything that you were talking about. It's like, oh no.
Yeah, it's a lengthy training, as I mentioned. Emma was really helpful in managing to cut it down. I think in the past, some of the training has lasted an hour and a half to almost a full 2 hours.
Yeah.
So we've reduced it, but we definitely want to make sure that all of this is in front of you. And sometimes it does involve hearing it a few times, but it's a good reference. Hopefully, that if some of these come into play, you can go back and check it out.
Yeah. Thank you. One of the things, so if nobody has any questions on our annual training, we'll move on to old business. With the first order of business under old business is a continued discussion of regulation of artificial intelligence. And David has provided a document in your packet of information. Do you want to provide an overview,
Sure.
David, of this document?
Yeah. So I think the BSRB is not alone, and licensing boards are not alone in trying to find out how best to approach the subject of artificial intelligence. I mentioned some of the rules that we follow, like the COMA and the CAPA and the CORA, linked to the fact that we operate under a state agency versus maybe what a company might be asked to follow. And so one of the documents that I provided for you is it's a 3-page document. It is from the Office of Information Technology Services, but it is something that was provided to executive branch agencies like the BSRB on the subject of generative artificial intelligence. And it's a policy that came out mid-2023. It talks about use of artificial intelligence software like ChatGPT, and it names a few others. And it provides some guidance to state agencies in terms of what you are not supposed to be using that technology for. And it talks about the responsibilities that state agencies have to make sure that if they are using something, that it's not harmful, illegal, or in violation of state policies. It talks about contractors disclosing use of artificial intelligence in certain ways. It talks about whether it's embedded in certain software. So this was provided to state agencies. There was not a lot of detail when this was released, and we have asked OITS if they could hold some sort of a forum where they could walk through this with state agencies, talk about maybe how we can make it more applicable. But I wanted you to see a copy of it to see what we have been asked to follow as part of this conversation. So that's one of the 3 documents. There's another document that I included. I realize this is from a different profession, but this is a 6-page document from the American Association of State Counseling Boards, AASCB, and it focuses on supporting the safe and ethical use of AI in mental health counseling. So I thought you would find that to be interesting as well. They issued this back in November of 2024, but it talks about AI education for boards and how to look at different tools. It also talks about things like informed consent and following state and federal laws. And then what licensees should consider when using AI tools for things like in crisis management care. I thought that was kind of interesting to talk about AI through a filter of what maybe similar boards like the BSRB are trying to figure out in terms of our role, how to regulate this and how it comes into play. And then there was a third document here, and it is lengthier. So feel free to review this between now and the next meeting if you have any additional comments, but it was drafted by a few different organizations, one of which being the Kansas Health Institute. And it talks about developing artificial intelligence policies for public health organizations. And it is a template and also provides guidance. And so this was just released in January of 2025. I would encourage you to go through and take a look at this. There is more information on the I believe it's linked to on the KHI website. But I found this to be interesting as kind of a walkthrough. They talk about the purposes of AI, having a policy, a template, and also supporting guidance. Some of the key principles and the scope, a little bit of data privacy, some of the bias involved with some of this, the importance of having human oversight and transparency and training on the use of AI. And so I would recommend looking through that. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on this document. I know there's a few different organizations that have been working on this, and now we are seeing some of the results of some of their work. So I feel like it's important to share this information with all of you. Part of this process is not just jumping in right away and putting in a rule for artificial intelligence, but I feel like part of this is about all of us educating ourselves to what really is artificial intelligence and what are people using out there, but then also from a regulatory board standpoint, how can we be helpful in terms of setting up guardrails or expectations, but also what things should we be thinking about or what should licensees be thinking about as they're using some of these tools. So just kind of want to share these documents with you. I'm sure we'll come across some others, so I will continue to build sort of a library of these types of documents to share with you. But I am curious if any of you have any preliminary thoughts, or if you've seen some of these documents before, or if you've seen other similar documents on AI from other organizations, if you have thoughts you'd want to discuss today.
This is not a question about the content, but just about the, because this is an open meeting, are these documents then free to be shared with others?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I think the generative policy for state agencies that was shared with a number of different agencies about a year and a half ago. And then
Okay.
AASCB, that one is linked on their website. And the Health Institute's policy document, I think that is linked on their website as well. So these are all public. So yeah, feel free to share these with others as you would like to. So.
The BACB also had a newsletter blurb about AI that I think we've talked about in this meeting before that you might want to add to your little library of AI related things.
Okay.
Is that one of the things, Allison, that you can share with David?
I think we have. I'm like very certain we've talked about it in this meeting before. So
Yeah.
I think I've sent it to him before. I can resend it if needed.
Yeah.
I think
That would bump it up to the top of his email.
Yeah, these were new things I didn't think the committee had looked at before. I seem to recall that maybe I had sent something out with a link for some of those materials for the BACB before, but
just one other thing from like 2022, I think, is as early back as I think it was in. That might have been like a couple years ago that we talked about it, but I know we talked about it in here.
So I know this will probably be a continuing conversation, but does anybody have any new thoughts since the last time that we talked about artificial intelligence? Have your personal views on artificial intelligence changed recently? Or I know there was a lot of concern and fear, and I think at least some of the initial discussions seemed like it was more geared to almost avoidance and saying, well, you know, you don't know where the data is going, you know, and for good reason. You want to make sure that you have good, you know, security on all of those things. But I'm curious. I saw a recent article too, and I didn't include it in the packet, but there was something that talked about the development. I think it was Chat GPT for government that just came out, and I haven't had a chance to look into it. I just kind of saw a headline. So I am curious if they are trying to develop a Chat GPT that would have more a closed system, so there'd be more secure. Um, so I don't know. I was curious if any of you have had new thoughts about artificial intelligence based on things that you've read recently or seen.
My stuff is not necessarily a fear related thing. It's more of a concern with like people using it inappropriately in our profession, putting HIPAA related information in there and not knowing how it can be accessed given the current state of the world. So it's not really a fear, it's just a slight okay, what's going to happen if someone uses this inappropriately, and how are we as a profession going to help monitor and make sure people are adequately trained on it, one, but two, also knowing that they know how to use it in a safe way. Because it is a great tool, trust and believe, but it's new. And so it's not scary, it's just new.
Well, one of the things that I had learned that I did not know, and I think it was Alice that educated me on it, was that when you type something like into the open, like Chat GP, that becomes part of their database that they use to continue to develop their generative responses to it, which taps into what you're saying. If you have somebody that puts clinical documentation or notes into it in order to be able to help with the insurance documentation burden, that right there is liable. That's liability right there. So I don't know if, and I don't even know how that would work, David, because one of the next topics on our agenda, if I can get back over there, where'd my mouse go, is discussion of topics, well, under new business, discussion of topics for 2025. I don't know if we want to keep this on our docket and add 2 recommendations each meeting so that by the end of the year we have recommendations for behavior analysts in the use of AI for clinical services. And, you know, I don't even know if that's something that's within the scope of our function as an advisory committee.
Well, so there could be recommendations to the board, and the board would need to decide if they wanted to issue something. The board generally doesn't do like advisory opinions. It's more so the board would pursue a rule change, you know, something in the regulation or the statute. And part of that is because as a, you know, we went through the training as a creature of statute. It's more of an association's role to kind of talk about best practices or things that maybe it would be a good idea for you to do, or maybe you should do. Whereas with the state agency, it's more of these are your legal requirements, and if you don't do these, there could be a penalty. And so, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't provide some assistance and be helpful in some way. It's just we'll have to kind of work within the parameters and the jurisdiction that we have.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that may be something more suited to CONSABA, which is becoming more and more active as we go forward, as more and more things start to drop.
Now, I don't think it would be a bad idea for the advisory committee to kind of keep a running list of thoughts and concerns or possible solutions, and then you know, continue to learn from these articles and different things, and then to have something to provide back to the board at a certain point and say, you know, the advisory committee met, these were the different things the advisory committee learned. And then say, you know, here is what our thoughts were, and we would encourage you as a board to take action given these thoughts and concerns. So,
Oh, so that's a good idea. So what we could do is discuss it and just start coming up with a document of things that we learn about it that may be concerning, or you know, maybe the pros and cons, and then send it to the board and say, based on what we learned, we recommend the board come out with a policy or recommendations, or at least, you know, a list of pros and cons on the website to help inform the public and our licensees in the state of Kansas, something along those lines.
yeah, I think that would be very helpful, I think, for the board to use for reference when they're considering what action the board wants to take at the board level.
Okay,
Is there
so
any
let's keep that in
value?
mind. Sorry.
Is there any value in the advisory board coming to the board and saying, or asking for, or reviewing, maybe volunteering for work I'm not prepared to do, but you know, an explicit application or explanation of how AI is covered by state policy or state legislation or whatever. Because it really feels like what we're trying to do here is figure out how this new thing fits into existing statute, existing regulations. We haven't formally done it. We wouldn't formally do it, but the board would. Is that something we could advocate that the board consider, is adding an explicit AI policy, or recommending to the legislature to add an explicit AI policy, whatever that may be, policy, statute, either one.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I think those could be recommendations forwarded to the board. Most of the recommendations usually get forwarded to the board either through your advisory committee chair, Linda, or potentially through me. And so you could work on those types of things and then for those recommendations. But yeah, ultimately it'd be the board to be the body that would either take action on that or not. But I think the more background the board had, it would be helpful to kind of review the work, because the board members, you know, we do have a board member here as chair and a public board member who are present. But because of the 7 different advisory committees, we have different board members serving in each role. So anything that can be brought forward to the board to help inform them, that would be good, I think.
So keep that in mind as we look at our topics for 2025. So the other, anything else on that before we move on to the next agenda item is continued discussion on adding a description to the BSRB website to inform the public. We had used AI a couple of meetings ago to generate a user-friendly description of what a behavior analyst does. I think that's probably gotten pushed down in everybody's emails from when we did that. So perhaps what we could do is move that to our next meeting. And David, maybe we could include some of that information that we had previously provided, so it bumps it back up to everybody's consciousness, or the top of their, you know, forefront of their brain. And that can be one of the first things on our agenda for next time, so we can finalize that. Does that work for everybody? Do I see general consensus? Yes. Okay. And then the discussion of topics for 2025, I think we can also think about that. I think AI really should be one of them. But one of the things that I really want to talk about in our last 4 minutes is sit in this meeting, because it is on, it's a hot topic on advocacy for the consumers we serve and for our livelihoods in general. But I want to hold on just a second, Alice. I want to come back to what David talked about in his annual training, which is coma, right? So Alice,
Linda, thank you for bringing that up. I just want to also add that I just learned today that also the telehealth regulations that was loosened after COVID-19 also is also might be a part of that. So
okay,
with the March, I forgot what is the March sometime, the Congress like resolution or whatever. So I just want to share that as well. If we are talking about advocacy, telehealth would be another thing that would impact access to for families, but also for people who are doing telehealth.
yeah,
Is that federal or state level, Alice?
Federal.
that's federal.
Medicaid is
The
also
state,
federal.
yeah, the states are somewhat governed by the federal policy, and it was the federal Medicaid policy that loosened the regulations on telehealth. So Allison, do you have a question? We're 2 minutes till
I do.
the end of the meeting.
Can we talk about the April meeting since we can't talk about it? It's just the Friday of Kanzaba, and I know myself, Nikki, there's a couple other people that will be participating in the Friday shenanigans that happens with Kanzaba. So can we potentially move that to a different Friday?
Yeah. Everybody pull up your calendars.
I would love for it to be a Friday after.
I'm sure you would. That Friday after is open for me.
I will take, since I'm a bigger, I cannot be a chooser at this point. So you tell me where and I'll be there.
Concerning the BSRB calendar, Friday, April 18th is open as well.
Okay, awesome. Does it not work for anybody? It works for Wes, it works for Christy, works for Linda, works for Emily and Kelly. Mike,
Me
yes.
too.
Nikki, yes.
Let's see.
Alice, yes. Okay. Did I miss anyone? Alec, what about you? That works? Okay. So David, if we could potentially change that then.
Sure.
I am going to right now put a hold in here. Otherwise it's going to get eaten up.
Thank you, everyone.
And good for you for thinking ahead, Allison, instead of waiting till the last minute.
I did try before when they all got sent out and then was reminded of coma and all of those.
All right.
Allison, is that going to be at the KU Edwards campus again?
Yeah, it's the same place.
Okay.
We just announced our lineup, so everybody should go look. It's all really excited.
All right. So if there's if everybody's comfortable with moving the continued discussion of AI and the description to the next meeting, where we're going to talk about the description first and finalize it. And then we're going to move the meeting to the following Friday. And
one thing, Linda, about the federal stuff.
Yeah.
David, can I put an insert in for advocacy group here in the state of Kansas that's working on federal health defense stuff?
So Linda and I talked about this a little bit. Basically, the role of the advisory committee is really to assist the work of the board. But when it comes to education and informing about things, I think that's definitely germane to you all being aware of things that are going on in this area. So I wouldn't recommend people like support things from a different association, because that's kind of wearing a different hat. But if you just want to make people aware of an opportunity to learn more information or things like that, I think that falls under the education kind of component.
If anybody wants information on a federal health defense meeting that's coming up literally on Monday, email.
Yeah.
yeah,
There's also one for the state of Missouri coming up too called Legislation Day. I'll share that. Everyone.
And just make sure you're emailing individually. And then Allison, if you share the information, you share it on behalf of Kansaba. And because, you know, once you get 7 people, which all of us on here are invested in that, once you get those people altogether, you know, you run the risk if anything's discussed about the BSRB. So just be cautious.
Yes, ma'am. Understood.
Okay. All right.
And before the meeting ends, just one last note. If you have not taken the survey yet, or you know people who
Go
have,
take it.
I would encourage you to go ahead and take that. I know there's 1 week left, but we've extended it, but as soon as possible, I'd go ahead and knock that out. That way we have more good feedback from all of you.
Also, all of you Kansans, before you log off, look at the sunshine and the palm trees. I just need everybody to see it.
Oh,
Okay. Enjoy your snow. I'm going back to Arizona.
what? Where are you?
In Arizona.
Ah, okay.
I'm in the
I just
airport
know you
now
all.
on my way to Orlando, so
All right.
I'm with you.
It's beautiful here. So enjoy
All
your
right. I don't want to hear it.
Bye.
All right.
Love you all.
Bye.
All right. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you. Bye, guys.